Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we are going to talk about this system right here, which might be the absolutely perfect system for home labs and basically anybody that wants really fast networking in a light, low power box. Now, quick specs here. This unit has 3 2.5 gig Ethernet ports, it has 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports, and it even has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. It is called the R86S, and I'm gonna go through in this video why I think this might be the coolest system that we've reviewed this year. So game plan for today is we're gonna go through the hardware of the system. It's definitely different than a lot of the other systems that we've reviewed, but I think it's also really nice. So I wanna actually show off the hardware that goes into this. Then we're gonna talk about the performance. We'll talk about some of the use cases, just kind of running through, we've run this thing through a ton of different software suites. So I wanna kind of give you some idea of what we learned when we did that. We'll have a section where we go through the different pricing and options. This is definitely the higher end unit of all of these, and just kind of giving you some rough idea. As a higher end unit, it's probably about $465. And then finally, in the key lessons learned, I want to talk about who I think this box is for. Now you can find this unit under the R86S name from a number of different vendors, but the one that sent it to us is actually called GoWin. And you see that a lot of the stuff in here is labeled as GW. I think they might actually be the company that makes these. Now we don't have a sponsor for this video, but if you do want to help out the STH YouTube channel, you can always join our channel down below. There's a little membership feature, and that will just help us go buy a lot of the things that we use to either test this unit, but also just buy a lot of the units that are just kind of fun to just try out and get to show you guys. So with that, let's get to the hardware overview. Okay, so let's talk about the exterior of this chassis, because I think a lot of folks are gonna see the pictures of this and not exactly understand what's going on here. This is not a passively cooled chassis, but it is a very heavy metal chassis. I mean, that's kind of the first thing that you notice when you pick up this unit. I think this 10 gigabit version is something around like 460 grams or so. And then in terms of dimensions, this is 119 by 79 by 41. Okay, so let's start talking about the hardware that goes into this, right? Now, let's start with this side over here, because this is actually the most problematic side. I'll tell you why. It's a fun little story. The first thing you see is that we have USB 3 port, and then we have a TF slot. Now TF is basically used because it's a micro SD card slot, but you don't want to go and pay the micro SD licensing fee. So we have a TF card slot. And then we also have our HDMI output. Now, why I said this is actually a little bit of a problematic side is that there's a little tiny power button over here, and that little tiny power button actually came off. And so when I was putting it together just before doing this video, just to refresh my memory on the hardware in here, I actually forgot to go and put the little power button back in place, and you have to get it in there just right so everything kind of puts together and it stays in place. And so I put it together, and all of a sudden I heard this little rattling, and it was the power button rattling around in there. So I call it problematic, but that's just because I took it apart, and that's the issue that I had. That was my fault though. Okay, but let's get to the exciting side, and that's this little face right here. Along the top, you're gonna see we have a DC 12 volt, and then we also have another USB 3 slot. Next to those, you're gonna see 3 Ethernet ports. Now these are Intel i225V based ports, which means that these are 2.5 gig Ethernet ports. If you're thinking, hey, that sounds exciting, that's because it is. But what's more exciting might be what's below that, because we have a total of 2 SFP plus 10 gigabit ports. These ports also will run at 1 gigabit speeds, but we tested them out and we could not get them to run at 2.5 or 5 gigabit speeds. And so just want to say that these are either 1 or 10 if you want to use optics or DACs, but they're not going to run at multi-gig speeds. Now you might think in a low-cost device, these must be not very good 10 gig Ethernet NICs, and that is completely false, as we're going to see when we get inside this unit, because this is totally crazy inside. I do want to point out that on the top of this unit, there is a fan, and this is not a fanless unit. Let's just be very clear. It does get warm even though there is a fan, but that's not the only fan. You're going to see when we get inside that there's actually another fan, and the vent for that is right here on the back of the unit, or underneath the Wi-Fi antennas. Now we don't normally talk about packaging, because the vast majority of the units, like you see the Firewall units that we have back here, those things come in these brown boxes, maybe some just foam in there or something like that, but it's definitely not a nice experience. But on the other hand, the R86S comes in a nice little box. It has the model number on it. You open it up, and inside you can see that we have a nice form-fitting, just this black foam in here. And this was a little bit nicer in terms of packaging, which also means that you're a little bit less nervous about the unit arriving safely. One of the other nice bits about the packaging is that you get this little tiny driver, because there are 6 screws that you would use to access the inside of the system. Now, realistically though, there are 2 screws on the bottom, that you use this little tool, you open it up, and you have access to, I think, the parts that most people are going to service. So by undoing the two bottom screws, you're able to open this little flap, and inside here, I've already put a SSD, but you can see we have our M.2 SSD slot. And then we have the SFP cages. So here I'm using a WD Blue. Now this is not the fastest SSD, but the SSD speeds on here are actually not as good as I thought they would be. And then you'll see that we have this feature right here, and this is a little tiny fan. Now you might think that this is the CPU fan, but it's not. This little fan is actually designed to cool the 10 gigabit Ethernet NIC. You can see right here that we have the SFP Plus cages that are for that 10 gig NIC. And when we open up this system, what you'll notice is that this NIC is actually a NVIDIA Mellanox ConnectX 3 EN NIC, which means that we get actually a fairly decent network card. I mean, this is like a real server OCP NIC network card. And the reason I say OCP is that this is actually an OCP 2.0 NIC. Now, of course, the vast majority of the high-end industry is all on OCP NIC 3.0. And if you buy a server today, most likely you have an OCP NIC 3.0 slot, but the OCP NIC 2.0 was a older standard that was widely adopted, and it became an interesting thing because there are now companies that you can find like on eBay and elsewhere that will sell the ConnectX 3 NICs with little PCIe adapters, and you can buy them very inexpensively for 10 gigabit Ethernet. Okay, so at this point, we've shown off the fact that we have an M.2 slot for storage. We've also shown off the fact that we have the Mellanox ConnectX 3 10 gig Ethernet NIC, super cool for our 10 gig networking, but what about the rest of the system? What you'll notice is that the ConnectX 3 along with the M.2 slot, those are on this like little expansion thing. And then the main part of the R86S is actually this top part right here. So you can get these things without that 10 gigs. So if you're not gonna use a 10 gig, it'd be less expensive, considerably less expensive to not get that. It's also smaller. So we're just gonna point that out, but we have the unit that we have. The main motherboard though is super interesting because when you pull this apart, you'll see that we have the connection cables that go, and that really, those are providing the connections for the M.2 as well as the NIC back, and those are those kind of like coppery cables. But aside from those PCIe cables, we have the main motherboard, and when we pull that out, you can see that there's a little copper block with the cooler and that fan that's on the top of this unit. And then on the motherboard, there are a couple of features. So on the back side, closest to the ConnectX 3 NIC, you'll see that we have the 3 SLNMH, which are the Intel i225V NICs. On the flip side though, is probably one of the more exciting set of features because we get a whole bunch of things there. Now the processor in this is super interesting because this is the Intel Pentium Silver N6005, which we've seen a number of times in the Firewall units that we've reviewed previously. This is a 4-core, it's just 4 cores, there's no 8 threads or anything like that. It is a 4-core processor, and there is a couple features here that we should definitely talk about. The first one is the fact that this has an integrated GPU. So there is an iGPU in here if you do want that kind of feature. You can look up the features for the processor, it's on ARC and all that kind of stuff, but you do have an integrated GPU in this, so this is not just like an Atom C3000 series where you don't have an integrated GPU. It's a 10 watt TDP part, which is not necessarily high end, but it is much faster than some of the previous generation Atom parts that we've seen. On the board, we get not just the processor, there are a number of other features. For example, we get the DRAM chip. This system comes standard with 16 gigabytes of memory. Now, this memory, we checked it out when we were running, and it's actually running at DDR4 2933 speeds. Some of the low-cost firewalls that if you get them like pre-configured with memory, we've seen much lower speeds like DDR4 2133 and stuff. So it actually is kind of nice that you get that. On the flip side though, I do wish that you had the ability to go and expand the memory. So whatever you order this with, whether that's 8 gigs or 16 gigs, that is what you're basically stuck with. The other thing though is that although we have the N6005, there is another option for an N5105, and in the just kind of normal firewalls, I generally say for those, go get the N5105 because it's less expensive and it just tends to be the one that I think a lot of folks gravitate to. But since we actually have the actively cooled fan here, I think that the N6005 is actually doing pretty well. And I would say that in this unit, this would be a decent option. So let's talk about the Wi-Fi here. This actually comes with Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth, and it's an Intel-based solution. So this is not some kind of like just super cheapo solution. You actually get an Intel Wi-Fi NIC here and Wi-Fi 6. Like, I think that's awesome, the fact that you get a decent Wi-Fi solution in a little box like this. And so just remember that we have 3 2.5 gig ports, we have 2 10 gig ports, plus we technically have a Wi-Fi as well. So I mean, you get like 6 network interfaces in this little tiny box. The other thing though is that we have the higher end N6005 processor, we have 16 gigabytes of memory and the Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff. So that means we also get an eMMC solution here. So this little system, even before we put the M.2 drive like we have here in there, actually has its own storage, and it's 128 gigabytes, which is plenty for a lot of operating systems. We'll talk a little bit more about the operating systems that this came with and what we tried it with later, but just the fact that you do have some onboard storage for some applications is super awesome, especially if you're just gonna use this as a router or firewall device. There are a couple things though of this hardware that I would definitely change. One of the big ones is clearly, I think another USB port or 2 would be awesome. And I know there's not a lot of space on here, but the reason for that is just think about if you have a keyboard in one, you have a mouse in the other, you can't plug a USB stick in to go do an OS installation. So just like little things like that. Of course you can have a USB hub, I know, but just not having to use a hub and just having the ability just to go and plug things in, I think would be a little bit easier. So that's why I would like to see at least 3 USB ports in a future version. And of course, if this had, 3 USB ports, I'd be telling you, hey, I wish it had 4, right? Because that's just kind of how USB ports are. With that, let's get to the performance. Now, in terms of performance, this unit comes with the Intel N6005, which is a little bit faster than the N5105. And the fact that this is actively cooled means that we were able to maintain a higher level of performance a little bit longer than we have seen on some of the older N6005 units that we've had. Now, on the larger kind of passively cooled ones with like the larger chassis, we are able to see those N6005 units perform pretty well, but the older ones, this is definitely better. And unlike the 2.5 gig Ethernet firewall boxes that we've reviewed previously, I actually think that this one can benefit from the faster processor. And the reason for that is we did iPerf3 and we ran iPerf3, and I think on the 2.5 gig NIC ports, that of course everybody understands, you can run iPerf3 on the 10 GBase-T ports and get a 9.4-ish gigabits per second, or a little bit more than that if you do a little tuning and whatever. But I mean, you're basically at that 10 gigabit speed that you would normally see. So I guess folks are gonna ask, would I recommend this as a router? And what I would definitely say about it is I think that it is fast enough if you're not really doing a lot of firewall functions to go and pass that 10 gig Ethernet traffic. At the same time though, if you want to kind of run like a pretty high-end firewall, you want to do things like deep packet inspection on stuff and like actually do a lot of like the IDS stuff. I think you probably are going to end up wanting a faster processor. I also think though, if you want things like you want to have like a IPsec and you want to be doing 10 gig IPsec, you're probably going to want to have quick assist on your processor, not just have a kind of low-end, low-power processor, right? We did a whole piece on quick assist and showing the performance of that, both if you use the add-in card as well as on the Xeon D parts. So it's just kind of one of those things that, I think that you need to have realistic expectations of what you're going to see on a box like this. But at the same time, I have a hard time telling people that this is a bad solution. I mean, if this was a $1,000 solution, I'd say I probably would want to see a lot more CPU performance and just resources there. But on something that's $460, I would say that this is a very reasonable amount of performance in here. Okay, so let's talk about power consumption. First off, you get this like little power brick. It's a 12-volt power brick. So with that, let's go plug the 12-volt adapter in. And then what we do is we just go plug the little unit in right here. Okay, now that we have the unit plugged in, you're gonna start hearing, and you're probably gonna start hearing the microphones, just so you guys know, is like right here. But you're probably gonna start hearing a little bit of fan noise. I was gonna say that all the time that I've been running this and we're running benchmarks on it, there's always some fan noise. So it's not a silent unit, but I don't think it's too bad. I'll let you have a listen and you can kind of see the power consumption. So hopefully Alex will show you guys the power consumption over here. And while this is booting, I'm just gonna let you hear what this sounds like. Okay, so we've now booted into Proxmox, and I'll just kind of show you where we're at. We're at about 10.5 watts in terms of overall power consumption for this little box. Now, we don't have a lot of things plugged into it, and we're also not running the CPU at like any amazing levels or anything like that. One thing you can do is you can use things like these SFP to RJ45 adapters, and just plugging this adapter in without even another side, you're gonna see that we got an immediate spike of like 2 and change watts, right? So I think the big thing to keep in mind here is that we were showing the floor at about 10.5 watts. You get a little lower than that if you don't have the M.2 in there and you're just using the eMMC, by the way. But, I just kind of want to show that, like, there's kind of this base of, call it 10-ish watts. And then as you start plugging in, especially with the SFP and the NIC, you're using a lot more power. That Mellanox Connect X3 is spec'd for, I think, up to around 15 or so watts. And we'll actually use over 10 watts very often. So just those two 10 gig NIC ports alone, those actually use about as much as the entire system uses at idle. And when I had this thing connected to one 2.5 gig NIC, as well as I had a 10G base T connection coming out of this little SFP right here, when I had just those connected, I was already into about the 20-ish watt range when running a little bit of workloads. And so, you can definitely get this thing up into the mid 20s and a little bit higher into like 30 watts if you go and start loading this with like kind of higher end optics, as well as like, higher end CPU utilization, and then plugging all the network ports in. So from a range of power consumption standpoint, I would say that at the low end, without, an M.2 SSD or anything like that, you're probably in that 8 to 8.5 watt range. And then as you kind of get higher and you start adding all the, configuration options and stuff like that, you're going to start to see power consumption get into that maybe 30 watt range. And oh yeah, by the way, we did test these with the SFP adapters and they totally work. Okay, so let's talk about the operating systems that we installed with this, because I think that that's important as a foundational element to talk about, like, who is this for? So in terms of the just kind of network operating systems, or what you use as like a router firewall, OpenWRT came with this unit, so we're going to say that that works. But then also we did do pfSense as well as OPNsense. So for those three, no problem to get them running on this box. And so I think that from a firewall, just straight firewall perspective, super easy to go do. Installing non-firewall OSs is where things got a little bit more interesting, because something I really wanted to do was install a hypervisor on the eMMC and then use the M.2 as a data store, because I thought, like, hey, that would be an awesome model. So the first thing we did was we put VMware ESXi 8 on here. And of course, because it's VMware, they did not support the SFP plus NICs. Also, VMware did not want to install onto the eMMC, so the option was really to install it onto the M.2 SSD that we had there, which kind of blows up the ability to have a hypervisor OS as well as a M.2 just for like kind of data storage. Now, we tried Proxmox VE 7.3 on this as well, and it worked with no problems except for one, which is also that it did not want to install on the eMMC. The plus side, of course, is that because it's Proxmox and we actually have good driver support, we get the Mellanox Connect X3 support, no problem in here. So that was very exciting to see. And then once you're in Proxmox, you can see the eMMC storage. You just can't install it as your root for OS installation, which is kind of a bummer, actually. Now, in terms of putting Windows on this, again, eMMC was a no-go. M.2, it worked. I don't know if I would necessarily do that. I don't think this makes a great Windows desktop, and I don't think it's fast enough really to use as a Windows server. But if you wanted to, you can run Windows on here. I just don't know. I think it's just a little bit limited for a Windows platform. So from a key lessons learned, what did we learn? And I think that OS in just the installation exercise really kind of taught us a couple things. First off, I think as a router firewall device, I think that makes a lot of sense on this box, right? The fact is that with OpenWRT, pfSense, and OPNsense all working on this box, and having 5 NICs plus the Wi-Fi, you get a decent processor, but you don't get things like the quick acceleration that you might want, especially if you're doing like IPsec or something like that. I also just think that a lot of folks are going to see like the 10 gig NICs and they're going to be like, hey, I'm going to go run like my, high-end IDS and stuff like that. I'm going to go run all these tons and tons of firewall rules, and like I'm going to have amazing performance. And the fact of the matter is that you just don't have a fast enough CPU in this for running like 10 gig speeds and like replacing a $10,000 or $20,000 firewall device, right? I mean, this is just not that fast. At the same time, if you're just trying to do like a pretty simple NAT setup or something like that, it's actually not too bad for a solution like that. The hypervisor side was a much more mixed bag than I was hoping it would be. It would be awesome. Like if the VMware folks, you could actually install VMware onto eMMC on this. I think this would be like endgame. They would be totally just jazzed on this, and they would just buy gobs of these things. You know, I just kind of think that it's a bummer for the VMware folks that they can't use all this really cool hardware because they're in just such a limited ecosystem. This box is probably not the right one for that. However, there is a version of this, of course, without the SFP Plus, so maybe that would be a better version if you just wanted a small 3-port 2.5 gig Ethernet solution. At the same time though, it feels kind of weird recommending this for that kind of application, because at the same time we have these Firewall boxes that have 4 NICs, and I think that's probably a better option if that's really the application that you're trying to go do. Also, if you're just doing a 2.5 gig, Firewall, I kind of think the passively cooled boxes, those are better to me as well, because, you don't have a fan that can fail. So I just kind of like those a little bit better. The Proxmox folks, I think actually this is a really interesting box because you can install Proxmox onto the M.2. You can run your little virtualized firewall. You can run a whole bunch of other things like Guacamole or something like that. And if you needed to get more storage, well, that's where you really use those dual 10 gig ports to provide my storage to my little hypervisor box. And I think that kind of setup where you have, the 10 gig for your storage, you have an out of band, and then you have your WAN and LAN, or maybe, two LANs and 1 WAN or something like that. I think that actually makes this box super useful. And that gets me to my final thoughts on this, which is really that this is probably one of the absolute coolest boxes that you can possibly imagine, but it's also one that is probably the hardest to go and figure out the use case for. Overall though, I think that this box is super awesome, and it definitely gets my seal of approval, because this is probably one of my favorite boxes that we've tested this year by far. With that though, if you like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.